Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Salendrovo. I'm a doctoral fellow at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa, based in the University of Cape Town in South Africa. On behalf of the HUMA team, you're all welcome and thank you for joining us in our African epistemology seminar series. Our speaker for today is Professor Blair Rutherford, who is an anthropology professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in the University of Carleton in Ottawa, Canada. He's also a director of Carleton's Institute for African Studies. He has carried out ethnographic research on cultural and politics of rural livelihoods for nearly 30 years in different sub-Saharan African countries. He is currently working with colleagues from Canada, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Kenya on research that looks at gender dynamics in artisanal and small-scale gold mining. Among other publications, he is the author of Working on the Margins, Black Workers, White Farmers in Post-Colonial Zimbabwe. He's also the publisher of Farm Labor Struggles in Zimbabwe, The Ground of Politics, which is published by Indiana University Press. His talk today is going to be centered around mining time, temporalities, labors, and gendered positions in alluvial gold sites in Manica in Mozambique. Professor Blair, thank you so much for your time. You're welcome in the space and looking forward to your talk. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Great, many thanks, Sane, for the great introduction. And I want to start by acknowledging that Carleton University, in which I'm currently located, as well as Ottawa, the city, is located on traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We do this a lot in Canada to acknowledge the ongoing Indigenous rights struggles going on in our own country. I also want to warmly thank HUMA for the invitation, particularly to Sanya for inviting me to speak here. And I have to admit, it's a bit of a poignant talk because about 11 or 12 years ago, Sanya and I met through the work of Pius Adesami, my late friend, our late friend, my late colleague, and an outstanding Africanist who, as you may know, passed away in that very tragic Ethiopian Airlines flight 2.5 years ago. But the poignancy kind of makes it even more important for me to give this talk, and partially because of that, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to be mainly reading my talk. Usually I like to talk with PowerPoint slides because it's a bit more easier to follow and engaging. But sometimes when I do so, I start meandering all over the place, and what should be a 30-35 minute talk ends up being 45, 50, 55 minutes talk. So I don't want to do that. So I want to be a bit disciplined by reading, but also this is kind of a work in progress for me. So I'm still kind of working through my ideas. I really look forward to getting feedback from you all. So this is I really welcome this talk. So I'm going to share my screen. Go. Okay, I think, oops, not there. Do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, excellent, great. All right, so I will start the talk now. The landscape was so altered, I initially could not get my bearings. I was on a path from the main dirt road some 12 kilometers north of the small town of Vila de Manica, Manica district in central Mozambique. What had been during the previous 3 dry seasons a well-trodden route winding around numerous residential yards with several brick houses and mud thatched huts, along with a rare artisanal gold mining shaft in the yard on the north side, and farming fields intermixed with many shafts hugging the south side of the path, now had very different physical features as I walked down it in late June 2018. Several hundred meters from the road, the footpath now narrowed, as along the south side were 3-meter-high sand embankments that eventually cut off the footpath itself. Almost every yard around houses on the north side was now full of artisanal mining shafts, of men and women working to extract and process ore-laden soil, looking for alluvial gold. When I climbed up the sandy path carved into the embankment, I saw on the other side several large pits with 2 backhoes operated by Chinese men digging up the soil and depositing it in large mechanical James tables, with a few Mozambican men deploying thick water hoses to break down the soil falling over the sieves. And you'll see a picture about that later in my talk. The Chinese small-scale mine that had been mining an alluvial gold site to the north the year before had now begun mining in this area previously mined by artisanal miners. As elsewhere in Africa, small-scale Chinese mines have been a growing presence in Manica district over the last 8 or so years. But the responses to them in terms of the labor and livelihood strategies varied dramatically, just as the responses of the Chinese mining companies to artisanal miners and those who live in the area followed different pathways in particular sites and over time. Given the noticeable physical changes over a short period of time emerging from the Chinese small-scale mine, a feature of resource extraction more broadly, I draw on recent scholarship focusing on what's called timescapes, the entanglements of spatial and temporal dimensions and the politics of time in artisanal mining to examine some of the gendered cultural politics informing these economic changes. In so doing, I want to put forward 2 larger points for you to think about and as I speak. Although we likely all have a sense of the dramatic spatial changes to landscapes that emerge through most mining operations, it's important to recognize that the landscapes they displace or transform had their own particular forms of often unequal and contested social usages. This is particularly relevant when talking about changes to landscapes that had already been used by artisanal miners. This can be visibly shown through a series of Google Earth photos of a place not too far from my opening vignette, which is called Fenda. Okay, let me just get onto here. So this Google Earth photo is from May 2019, and it visibly shows dramatic changes to the landscape from this Chinese small-scale mine. And again, I'll end my talk about this very area in Fenda. And you can notice the changes when you go to a Google Earth photo a few years earlier, and you see predominantly vegetation, and you do see some kind of mining, quote unquote, scars, which came from artisanal mining. They're kind of interspersed, but not as visible as the 2019 transformations caused by the Chinese small-scale mine. However, it's important to also think about how these landscapes have changed even before this. So you go back 5 years earlier in November, so it's a different time of the year, it's November, but this is the start of a gold rush in Fenda, where some rich veins of gold were found, and hundreds upon hundreds of men and women descended on this area to do artisanal mining. As you can see, visibly transforming the landscape in a way somewhat akin to the Chinese small-scale mine. And this is again noticed when you go back year previous, and you see, you don't see any sign of mining. And to the best of my knowledge from the oral histories, mining only really began in this part of Manica district in 2011. I'm going to suggest that looking at these spatialized socioeconomic uses can be fruitfully examined through looking at the ways in which socioeconomic dynamics are interwoven with gendered labor relations on the mines and in households. Which leads to the second point I want you to consider as I speak, which is the importance of examining how these mining timescapes are gendered in various and at times unexpected ways. Although there have been growing and important studies on the gendering of mining and the varied involvement of women in mining activities in sub-Saharan Africa by excellent scholars like UCT's Asanda Benya, who's done brilliant work up in the platinum mines in South Africa and women working in and around them, as well as by Rose Bashwira, Kuntala Lahiri Dutt, and Doris Buss on artisanal small-scale mining. There is still a common assumption among many scholars, policymakers, civil society activists, and the media that either women are not involved in mining or that they're simply the victims of mining. In so doing, women's struggles and livelihoods become flattened out, if not erased. Instead, I suggest that the diverse ways that men and women responded to the alterations to their mining livelihoods made by the expansion of the Chinese in 2018 show how changes in economic temporalities associated with the new mining landscape are also entangled in gender dependencies implicated through family dynamics. So the research for this paper involved conducting participant observation and interviews in artisanal gold mining areas in Manica district in and around Villa de Manica. So this is Mozambique here. Manica district is right here, hugging the border of Zimbabwe. You can, on the left here, you can see the border between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. In the circle here is the town, the district capital, Villa de Manica, and all my research was kind of up in this area north of Villa. And I did this research in 2015 to 2018. My research got canceled in 2019 because of the destruction of Cyclone Idai. And it's been part of a larger 3-country research project on gender in ASM. And I really want to warmly thank my colleagues in Mozambique, Kenya, and Sierra Leone, as well as my colleagues in Canada, particularly Doris Buss, who kindly read an earlier draft of this paper and gave me really helpful feedback. So after very briefly sketching out some conceptual arguments, I then discussed the gendered timescapes of labor in the gold mining areas of Manica and how they responded to the growing presence of Chinese mines. For various political and economic reasons, ASM has become a key income generating activity across sub-Saharan Africa this century. As Lorenzo D'Angelo and Robert Pipers insightfully show, mining temporalities is a concept that allows one to examine resource extraction as a, to quote, complex mesh of durations, rhythms, and cycles, with different velocities, intensities, and extensions that different social actors try to know, tame, or manipulate by synchronizing or desynchronizing them in line with contingent and often conflicting strategic interest. The routinized durations and rhythms of work and their contestations form what they call a politics of time. In short, time matters as varied temporalities shape socioeconomic practices within mining landscapes. Here I show how this politics of time becomes implicated in those shaped by gendered family or household dynamics. These interdependencies are hierarchical and can be exploitative, but they also can generate sentiments of support, affection, and solidarity. By analyzing labor as a relation of production and at the same time an activity that is informed by gendered relations of dependency and interdependency, I propose that new insight emerges on work and authority relations within artisanal mining. So now I'm going to briefly give you a sense of the timescape of the artisanal gold mining going on in 2015 to 2017. Many men and women enter into artisanal gold mining in Manica for a multitude of reasons. Many do it because of poverty. We do not like artisanal mining, Hatiti Jigweja, declared a woman, expressing a widely shared sentiment among women and man miners. We are here because we are poor. Though others with some capital do use artisanal gold mining to supplement and improve their material conditions. So there are different class dynamics going on of those involved with the mining activity. This economic activity in Manica also has attracted many Zimbabwean men and women, many fleeing poverty, if not politics in Zimbabwe, and finding ways to remain and work in Manica district. There was pre-colonial gold mining in this area and a history of colonial mining companies operating from the late 19th century onwards. But most in Manica associate the start of gold mining in the most recent period, shortly after the formal end of the civil war between the Frelimo government and the Renamo rebels in 1992. This time in mining is not a uniform procession of unfolding seconds, seasons, and years through what Walter Benjamin famously called homogeneous empty time, but was etched into the social landscape and the bodies of many as markers of moving forward or backwards, or both, as anticipatory as well as lament. Material presences and absences marked arcs of success or loss or further loss in many conversations I had with people involved in gold mining. Look at the house there, said one man, pausing with his shovel as he took a break from starting to dig a shaft, motioning towards the yard 20 or so meters away one June 2017 day. Bricks, paned windows, zinc roof, satellite dish, all from gold. In addition to new houses under furnishings in the rural areas or in the nearby town of Villa, others pointed to vehicles, motorcycles, cars, backies, cattle, or for some man, the ability to pay bride wealth for a wife or a second wife. Absences could also signal such success, as when miners repeat stories of those who made it and left mining in the rural areas, like Fenda, the man who was eponymous for the gold rush site I was showing you the satellite pictures of, As being able to earn so much as a landowner, he gave up his rural home and moved to town in Chimoio, the provincial capital. But disappearances often also signified loss of family members and friends crushed under collapsed tunnels, of former maize fields made unproductive by scores of abandoned shafts, and the accelerated passage of youth through scars, calluses, and injuries forged through the hard work of excavating, transporting, and processing the ore. Such individual success or losses through gold mining are contingent, but dependent in part on key aspects of the gendered timescapes and the politics of time within specific artisanal placer gold mining operations. For those excavating shafts, the key temporal rhythms concern permissibility, capital, and labor. There are competing authorities who can determine whether one can excavate or not. Much of the alluvial gold mining north of Villa Dominica occurs on someone's usufruct land. The typically male household head, having usufruct rights to this land, needs to grant permission before anyone can open up a shaft. With the owner's permission and in exchange for 1/3 of any gold found, the artisanal miner, typically a man, becomes a shaft owner and can start digging. However, there are at least two other irregularly timed forces that can affect the permissibility for artisanal mining. Traditional leaders, the chiefs, can shut down mining in their territory, though only for short periods for reasons marked as cultural, such as funerals. In some of the mining zones, traditional leaders prohibit women from working on the grounds that mediums for land spirits, Mondoro, claim gold but disappear if women go near the excavation areas. More frequently, but also on an irregular schedule, armed state officials may come to close down or threaten to shut down artisanal gold mining sites, largely on environmentalist reasons, as the provincial government had long identified this activity as the main source of sedimentary pollution in the rivers. In 2016, a new security branch had been created in the name of protecting Mozambique's natural resources. These armed environmental police, nicknamed Fauna, initially shut down many of the alluvial gold mining sites in Manica in 2016, chasing away miners. But within a year, they often translated this power instead into a demand for fines for miners, the payment of which allowed mining to continue, like a tax, as one miner put it. For many excavating, accessing capital for digging and processing work, as well as in the form of sustenance, is rarely a straightforward unfolding of time. Although artisanal alluvial gold excavation in this area typically meant digging a shaft between 3 and 12 meters before hitting a gold seam, not everyone had the tools necessary to carry out the work. For accessing such equipment, most male shaft owners entered into credit relationships and dependencies with sponsors and buyers. Some relationships could be tense, including their pivoting on the uncertain future of finding sufficient gold to pay back the debt. Women miners faced even more challenges in getting credit, let alone permission for some type of work. No sponsor or gold buyer I met would lend equipment or credit for women, largely because the assumption was that they would not find enough gold to make it worthwhile. The assumption was oft correct, caused by the barriers women faced in trying to excavate. A few women still dug in territories where the chiefs did not prohibit them from doing so and where the landowner permitted. But without financial support, they dug slowly and less deep. Aside from a few Zimbabwean women who were gold buyers, most women worked in gold either helped in transporting or processing it and or reprocessed tailings or already washed ore-bearing soil, looking for missed traces of gold. This panning work, what's called kuparapara, was normatively viewed as women's main work in gold mining. Accessing labor is a third rhythm subject to a politics of time. There are different labor arrangements in Manica's alluvial gold mining work. For male shaft owners that either work with a small group of male friends or relatives, or they allow different teams of male workers to work through the shaft in what they call shifts, in exchange for 1/3 of any gold found. At other times, however, the labor for digging, transporting, and processing was informed by family dynamics and what Katie Gardner called the particular gendered expectations and designs for life one had depending on normative models of the life course. Most of the people working in the artisanal gold mining zones were young men. The Zimbabweans often talked about directing some of their gold mining money towards filial or other family obligations back in Zimbabwe. I sweat here, as one put it, so my younger brothers can go to school and my mother can buy some farming inputs back in Gutu in Zimbabwe. Both Zimbabwean and Mozambican young men aspired to gain enough money to become husbands themselves. In their deeply commoditized socioeconomic lives, to meet the design for life of an adult man requires having income, not least to pay bride wealth for what they viewed as a respectable marriage. Many older male miners had women partners. For those who lived with their wives and partners, women not only carried out most, if not all, of the domestic work, but also often were involved in their own income generating activities, working in petty trade, or for some, working in the artisanal gold mining site. I'm going to talk now about women. Women follow man. For many women living in Villa Dominica and the areas to its north, their livelihoods were shaped by the timescapes of artisanal gold mining. Let me again briefly sketch out some of these dynamics in the period 2015 to 17. Woman follow man noted a young woman sitting in the yard of her house, watching man process the ore-rich soil, which had been excavated from a shaft in her yard, in a dam nearby. She said this in reference to women's work in and out of artisanal mining. She meant both literally and in terms of dependencies. Many women who pan followed men who dig, seeking to reprocess either the tailings next to their shaft or the soil where the man had been washing the ore-bearing soil. While many did not follow their husbands, indeed some women preferred working separately in different artisanal gold mining zones, married women made it clear that the work in mining itself depends on their husband's permission. Husbands can and did prevent their wives working in artisanal mining, as they saw it as tough work, revealing that their families are poor, depended on their wives doing this disreputable labor. Women explained their husband's influence over the labor by noting he's the baba, the father of the family, and thus has authority over what family members do. This meant that husbands can and did get their wives to help transport or process the ore coming from their shafts, typically carrying out this labor without direct payment, as it was family labor, its remuneration based on the interdependencies of conjugal life. An older woman in her 50s, I call Mai Priska, told me in 2018 that when her husband started digging shafts on their own land in 2004, to quote, he had me transport the soil and remove the water from the shafts. He paid me nothing. When he didn't need me to work on his shaft, I would do the same work for other men digging shafts on our land for payment. She also noted that over the last few years, she ended up collecting the landowner's share, which is 1/3 of all gold found, from the gold mining carried out on their land. As she said, she is too old to carry out mining work anymore. But unlike before, when she had kept some money she earned through mining, to quote, now I give my husband the gold I collect and he sells it. It is he who decides how to spend it. He is the owner of the land, so it is his. For married couples who have land, husbands tend to be the de facto landholder. Some of them shared with their wives any money they received from gold mining operating on it, but was not consistent, while others refused. It depended on the particulars of their conjugal contract, to use Anne Whitehead's felicitous phrase. Another woman reflected on the very different control of her time as a wife compared to when she began mining as a girl. To quote, the difference between mining now and when I was 14 is that now I need permission from my husband to work and I'm responsible for household chores, unlike before when it was mainly my mother's responsibility. But being a female member of a family that controls productive gold shafts can also be beneficial, for she is positioned in a more influential way in the kin and shaped entanglements of spatial and temporal dimensions of the mining occurring on the land. For instance, the widowed daughter from a family that had gold-rich land created an innovative way of using her family position to gain income. After her husband died in 2015, she began mining to make some money. In addition to panning, she also supplied empty large sacks to the shafts being mined on her father's land. In exchange for the sacks, each shaft owner gave her about 3 bags of ore-laden soil to wash. She and any siblings nearby then would wash the soil and evenly split any gold found. This unique livelihood practice was enabled, one male miner noted, because the shafts on her father's land provided a lot of gold, and shaft owners did not want to deny her request in case her father prevents them from mining there. In short, she used her family position in the timescape of the mining activities to extract a rent from shaft owners. However, most unmarried women did not have such a relatively wealthy natal family to draw upon, or one which was as supportive in assisting her. But the relative wealth of one's household, combined with gendered dependencies of household labor, did inform responses to the expansion of the Chinese mines. So here's the picture of the mining going on next to the path I described at the start of my talk. The Chinese presence in Manica district grew in the early 2010s, initially through opening up shops in Villa that sold mining equipment, motorcycles, and vehicle parts and supplies. Widely rumored to be supported by big people in Maputo as part of the Frelimo government elites, varied ways to acquire rents after it embarked on a neoliberal pathway after the end of the Civil War in 1992, Chinese small-scale gold mining companies began operating initially in the hard rock gold areas in the hills 20 or more kilometers north of Villa. In 2015 or so, some Chinese mining operations also began working in a few alluvial gold areas previously mined solely by Magweja, the artisanal miners. This increased dramatically since 2017, reducing the number of artisanal placer gold mining areas. In 2018, I heard many complaints by Magweja and others whose main source of income depended on artisanal gold mining about the drastic reduction in business. As a few man and woman put it, in and around Villa Dominica, money circulates only when Magweja are digging. All the gold buyers I knew complained drastically about Machina, the Chinese. One Zimbabwean woman gold buyer told me she contemplated returning to Zimbabwe, saying that, to quote, "These days when the police come by asking for money to pay a fine, as she didn't have a buyer's license, I tell them, sorry, but I have no money at all to give you now with some China. And they leave me alone." A West African gold buyer also was looking for some capital to relocate to Zimbabwe, as he had heard he'd be able to get back into buying diamonds in the Marangi area, as there had been changes after the overthrow of Mugabe. A Zimbabwean man working for one of the Lebanese buyers and smelters in Villa grimly noted, "Normally my boss would buy and melt 5 to 6 kilos of gold a month, but now we are buying only 600 grams as the Chinese are taking all their gold to a single buyer in town, and only a few Magweja have gold to sell." Those who have bancas or kiosks or cook food in the alluvial artisanal gold mining areas also declared that their business was severely down. There also were fewer of these small-scale businesses in the area I visited in 2018 compared to the previous years. The most noticeable changes, however, came from the actions of the miners themselves, but men and women often responded differently to the disruption of the previous timescapes that had informed their artisanal gold mining in the area, in part due to their class position in specific households, the gender dependencies and politics of time within the families, as well as the specific timescapes emerging in some of these Chinese mined areas. Some male miners switched to hard rock gold mining in the district in 2018 as a result of the takeover of alluvial mining sites by Chinese companies. Hard rock mining required finding more capital, typically through a sponsor, as it often takes longer to reach the gold seam. One may need more equipment, such as power drills, timber for beams, air hoses for oxygen generators, and so forth. And there are more steps in processing the gold, which could require payments, such as ball mills to crush the stone, mercury to amalgamate it, and so forth. With reduced money flowing in Manica, it was hard to find such a sponsor to go into hard rock gold mining. Other men worked in remaining artisanal placer gold sites in the area, including the yards of the homesteads next to the path I described at the beginning. There, the landowners told me they expected to be bought out by the neighboring Chinese mine, so they sought to get as much gold out as possible, seeking to extract as much economic value as quickly as they could before the Chinese take their land for limited compensation. I was also told that many men had migrated to artisanal gold mining sites elsewhere in Mozambique, like in Tet province. These men were both young and older, unmarried or married. They had access to some money, usually through borrowing from relatives, to travel these distances. Such abilities to be able to move more easily and freely were not always shared by women, especially if they had care responsibilities for family members. But there are also differential responses among women miners, due in part to the specificities of their particular family dependencies. Many married women who had land they co-owned with their husbands also lamented the Chinese. My Priska declared that almost all women who had been working in the gold mining zones taken by the Chinese are sitting at home. As with much fewer men working in alluvial gold mining, there's reduced work for many women and less tailings or already processed ore-bearing soil to reprocess. As a wife of a nearby chief put it, "Man can travel, but we women cannot follow them too far, as we have household responsibilities." Additionally, households near the Chinese mines had to contend with the surveillance and occasional demands of the fauna. The environmental police were no longer monitoring what they viewed as environmentally harmful practices, but rather groups of them were based at each Chinese mine, where they policed the territory being mined and occasionally made demands on nearby households. My Priska noted, for example, that the fauna demanded petrol from her and her husband. She wasn't sure why they did so, but she sagely remarked, "If they carry a gun, you don't ask." Moreover, some women found a way to continue with artisanal gold mining livelihoods in 2018, not in spite of, but because of the presence of the Chinese small-scale mines, at least one in particular, which created a relatively unique landscape for some artisanal mining activities in their area. Getting close to the end here, the second last slide. For a month or so before I arrived in late June 2018, this Chinese small-scale mine began to allow, to a degree, artisanal miners to reprocess the afterwash, the ore-bearing soil already run through the company's large mechanical James tables from some of the areas that it had already excavated. A relatively unique permissibility by Chinese mines in the area. However, the degree of allowance was directly related to the actions of the fauna based at the mine, who influenced the temporalities of work. So by the time I arrived at the end of June 2018, there was a daily rhythm that occurred. So this is the afterwash area, what the miners called the madraiga, which is a Chimanica-ized Portuguese word to talk about the area, to refer to the area that had been dredged. And there's hundreds of women and some men reprocessing the afterwash here. But by about noon, you'd see a few figures start leaving the Chinese mine compound. You could see up here on the other riverbank and slowly meander their way down the road and into the Madraiga area. As soon as those environmental police were spotted, all of the women and men gathered the equipment and moved back onto the opposite riverbank, which is over here, and watched. And in about 10 or so minutes, the environmental police would, put themselves in the middle of the Madraiga and wait. And in a few minutes, a couple of people, usually the few men, would come and liaise with them. And the fauna would then make a demand to these go-betweens for a certain amount paid by individual miners working the Madraiga or from them as a whole in order for them to continue mining. The go-betweens relayed this ask to the miners, some of whom would pay and continue working, and others would leave the mining site and come back early the next day, or for a few during night. A number of the miners told me that if the fauna were dissatisfied with how many were paying, or had wanted to impress upon the miners their authority, they'd occasionally resorted to arresting women or men working the Madraiga, or beating them up. Nonetheless, as the Madraiga was relatively rich in gold, many miners were willing to risk the violence and to potentially pay a daily fee. This willingness, however, was mainly exhibited by women who were unattached and or whose households needed the money. There's some young men working the Madraiga and a few married couples, but at least 80% of the people working this area when I was there were women. In part, the daily fine of between 3 and 10 points, and a point refers to a tenth of a gram, so 10 points is a gram, was less than what man would expect from digging a shaft once they reached the gold seam, and in part because panning was viewed as women's work. The reason why some women who had regularly mined now avoided the Madraiga and sat at home, as my Priska put it, is that most of these women were not as economically desperate, in part because of their family situation. Almost all of the women I knew or met who refused to go to the Madraiga were married. Their husbands had sufficient income generating activities, including having mining going on their land, and thus they did not feel compelled to go to the Madraiga. Moreover, these women were not keen to take the risk of being arrested or beaten. One older woman who had dug her own shafts in the past declared, "I'm too old to run away from the police," the environmental police. However, I did meet some older married women in the Madraiga, along with many unmarried women. They were there because either they needed money or they had no one preventing them from going. One older woman in the Madraiga said she only began mining in 2018, not in the Madraiga, but elsewhere, and her husband had started mining a few years ago. We both were in the selling business, she said, previously, but you can't make any money that way anymore. A man nearby overheard our conversation and emphatically stated that the Chinese are, to quote, taking our land and not helping us. They should open land for us to dig shafts on it ourselves, not leaving us the afterwash. As he left us, the older woman turned to me and said in a quiet voice, "I am pleased with my China. I'm getting good gold these days." So I'm getting to the conclusion now. Economic prospects held by the vast majority in artisanal mining were uncertain even before the expansion of the Chinese into alluvial goldfields. The specific timescapes in these artisanal mining areas existing before 2018 were precarious, particularly for women. This expansion of the Chinese resulted in divergent responses influenced by differing class and gender positionings within families. Some miners recognize such gender positionings and their temporalities have mattered in differentiating their possibilities in Manika's artisanal gold mining, with a few reflecting on their changes over time. For example, as I stood next to a 2-meter pile of reprocessed soil in the Madraga in July 2018, a Mozambican woman in her 40s, who I call my Pedro, suggested that there have been noticeable changes regarding women's participation in artisanal mining through alterations of the interdependencies within families. To quote, long ago, women would get married and husbands would take care of them. If you're a young girl, your parents would look after you. But now, young people and lots of married women are entering mining now. Although belied by oral histories that noted how married women have been involved in artisanal gold mining, at least since the 1990s, it does indicate widely held expectations of the hierarchical gender relations of care within families and the idealized gender designs for life shaped by life course models, difficult though they may be to realize. Moreover, some like my Pedro herself actively challenged some of these expectations. She told me that she began artisanal mining after her husband passed away in 2009. She initially mined in the close vicinity of Villa Dominica where she lived, working with her then teenage children. When the children grew older and could stay on their own, she began following the sample of gold, for she could stay at the mining sites themselves as she was free from childcare work. My Pedro challenged several norms. She was one of the few women miners following samples to dig shafts rather than following men to reprocess the excavated soil. Moreover, she worked in a team, which was very rare for women miners. She preferred working in teams, she added, as one could dig more gold that way, explaining that through mining, she had bought cattle and built a brick house in her rural home. As a Madraga, she worked with a younger sister and a male relative, both looking to be in their late teens. In the hour with which I spent with her, they had already found 8 points of gold, so nearly a gram, whereas in other panning sites I'd researched, women more commonly only get 1 to 2 points a day. In her remarks, she showed how some women work through the unequal dynamics of specific timescapes, working through and against gendered expectations during their mining time. Thank you. Get rid of the share.
Thank you, Professor Clay, for the great talk. I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. But before I open it to everyone, I just have one question. I'm just wondering how like cultural dynamics and gender roles, how can they be challenged? Because in the mining sector, it seems as if the roles women perform are determined by gender and not by effort or skills. How would you say this can be challenged? Thank you.
Thank you, Sanya. That's a great question. So some women definitely do challenge it, and women who dig shafts, which aren't many, they're challenging the expectations that women should only pan, kupara para. But as I said, they're disadvantaged from man shaft owners because they aren't able to get credit and so forth. So partially it would involve, from my perspective, a lot more action and support from civil society groups. And at least in this part of Mozambique, there aren't too many civil society groups working with artisanal miners. They're mainly working with farmers, and sometimes they see the artisanal miners as undermining farming. So there's tension between farmers and miners, though in practice, many farmers also, farming households also do mining on the side. But I think if you get more organizations supporting and working to permit women to dig shafts, to get credit, to be able to access equipment more easily, then there is the possibilities of women having more economic opportunities in artisanal mining. I mean, part of the challenge is some of the groups that work on artisanal mining in other parts of Mozambique don't really see women as miners. They assume they're only men. And there are other groups I know of who are there to try to rescue women from mining, to say it's, and instead to get into alternative income generating projects. This is how international development projects call such efforts, which of course usually does not provide anywhere near the same income and opportunity than artisanal mining does for women. So, I mean, the government is redoing their mining policies and laws right now, and I know there are some colleagues, including some of my Mozambican colleagues, are trying to push them to have a more gender sensitive and supportive framework, but I'm not too sure how successful that will be.
Thank you. I'm going to open it to the floor. Do you have any questions, comments? You can just raise your hand. Dr. Sanya, I see your hand, but I'm going to start with Dr. Asanda. Dr. Sanya, I'm sure you don't mind. Dr. Sanya, Dr. Asanda, please go ahead.
Hi, Shasane. Hi, Blair. Very interesting stuff you've presented on Mozambique. I kept being kicked out. I think I did not have my correct name at the beginning, so I hope I didn't miss some parts of your talk. Very interesting stuff that's happening out of Mozambique and Zim. I just had a couple of questions, and these are really just around how women are organized. I didn't get a clear sense of that in this. They're working together, but is there any form of like sort of really organizing themselves in working together, or it's just an informal kind of arrangements? You find people at the site today and you work with them, and if they are organized, how are they organizing themselves? I mean, like you're saying, this takes everything seems to be against them. So that's the first question. And the second one is, the people who are working in the Chinese mines, I didn't get a clear sense of like the wages. Are some of the people who are working in these Chinese mines in Mozambique the folks who were working as artisanal miners before? And what are some of the benefits if people have shifted from artisanal to working for these Chinese mines? What are the wages like actually, and also the working conditions? I mean, we've heard stuff coming out of DRC around working conditions inside some of the Chinese mines in the DRC, which I actually do not think are very different from the conditions of all the other mines. I'm not sure why we keep emphasizing the fact that the Chinese ones are. It seems to me that we're also reproducing certain stereotypes about Chinese working conditions being very different from working conditions in mining generally. So I'd like to just get a little sense of that also. And the last question is around resistance. Some of the stuff that I've been getting at, this is very refreshing for me hearing you talk about women who are doing all the kind of stuff that you've just shared with us. But what tends to dominate discourse coming out of Mozambique, at least my reading and the people, the social movements I've been in touch with, is people resisting mining in Mozambique, especially women whose land's been taken away from them, water sources and so forth. And so I'm wondering about this particular area, what makes it so different from others in terms of people buying into doing, and I heard you at the beginning obviously talking about poverty, people needing jobs and so forth, but I'm just wondering if there's more to it in relation to mining in particular, because these were agrarian, like people were doing farming previously, right? And now mining. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sunny, also for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Asanda. It's wonderful that you're here, because I've learned so much from all your great work. So let me quickly respond to your thoughtful, provocative questions. The first one about women are organized. They generally aren't organized. So women who are panning often will travel to the sites where they're panning with other women, though depending where they live, they may have to walk an hour and a half to the area, or they might just be living right next door. And then when they're panning, they tend to work on their own, except they may help each other washing on a sieve. They may help each other, particularly if pouring water buckets over the soil so the gold drops with gravity onto the carpet underneath, but they don't share the gold. And I mentioned the unique woman who I call my Pedro, who works in teams, and it's unique because most women said, I can't work in a team because I don't control my time, because they aren't sure if they're able to come every day because they may have household duties, or their husband may want her to work on her, if she's married, on her land, or her father, she's a daughter, may want her to work on his land or his mining activities. So it's really rare to find women who work together. The only kind of organization that the women involved in mining were involved with were in kind of rotating credit associations, but only the women who were able, who were productive women or whose families had money were part of that, and they would save their money and then buy both household items, and occasionally women who were a bit more successful at mining would buy more mining equipment. So the organization was not there, and then same, to be honest, with men. The men artisanal miners would work with groups of friends, and they would work together sometimes. They're doing shift work if they're on the artisanal mine, which was open to shift work, or a shaft owner and his friends would come together, his relatives. But there's no formal organization. The formal organization occurred in a few of the hard rock gold areas, and they were put into what's called associations, associação, which officially Mozambique says all artisanal miners should be in associations. They aren't necessarily the most effective, and at least one of the gold mining sites that I've done research on had an association, but it's really benefited, as you might know from literature on, say, co-ops in artisanal mining in DRC, for the benefit of the kind of the elite, whereas the people working in the mines didn't gain too much at all from it. So needless to say, there'd be lots of possibilities for organizing women, and we're working with a women's association, kind of an umbrella group based on Maputo, but they have a group in Chimoio, in the provincial capital, and we were getting at the stage of trying to work with them, to work with the women miners, when both the cyclone and then COVID hit. So all those plans are kind of in suspended for the moment, but we do hope, touch wood, next year the pandemic will lessen in both Southern Africa and elsewhere, that we can resume that work. In terms of wages, it's a great question. Funny enough, I really only studied the Chinese mines through the women working in the Madraga. So I didn't communicate with any of the Chinese miners or the companies or the Mozambicans working in the mines. The word from others said that, well, they hired few Mozambicans, not many, but it was viewed as a good job from the eyes of artisanal miners, because they would get a steady income, whereas artisanal mining is hit and miss if you're going to succeed or not in the mining, particularly with all the alluvial gold mining being taken over by the Chinese mines, at least in 2018. But I don't have firm ideas of what the conditions are, or working conditions, or the benefits. And your point about the tendency to demonize Chinese mines and ignoring mines owned and operated by others is spot on for sure. And I know some of the mining officials, local government mining officials I knew, talked about how when they would travel around with people from Maputo, the seniors from their ministry coming from Maputo to the artisanal mining areas, they would always look around at the artisanal mining areas, really upset about what they viewed as environmental damage and potentially pollution of water. But the officials would say, whenever we then went to mines owned by Mozambicans or Brazilians or not Portuguese or Chinese, all the big man would never look. They wouldn't look at the water. They wouldn't look at the pollution going on by these mines. So there's kind of two standards between the artisanal miners and the small scale mines in the areas. And the resistance towards mining is also a good point. Definitely in other areas in Mozambique, there is a lot of resistance, particularly kind of women in the wider community. And why that isn't the case? I mean, there are definitely farmers who are upset, and periodically you'll see in the Mozambican press, claims by the provincial governor about the need to either clamp down on artisanal mining or clean it up because of the pollution and so forth. And they would quote farmers who agreed, or people from farmers associations. It didn't seem to, at least in my experience, any actual resistance of the artisanal mining itself. And why that is, I mean, partially mining has been going on there for since the early 90s. And in fact, there's a bit of a legitimation story. Older miners would tell me, Mozambican miners would say, in 1994, President Chissano had come to Manica district, and he was telling people, according to how the story is told, to get into artisanal mining because either a few gold companies, European gold companies, South African gold companies around, but no artisanal mining. But Chissano said you should get into gold mining because you need to get money, particularly after all the damage of the war, because the civil war really took devastated this part of Mozambique. A lot of it happened in Manica province, as well as the central area. So there's a sense that they had the approval of the government, despite the fact the environmental police occasionally shuts them down. And also some people explain it by the fact that starting in the late 90s, but particularly this century, so many Zimbabweans have come into Mozambique, just like in South Africa and elsewhere, due to the devastation in Zimbabwe. And many of the and then especially also after the Marange diamond mines was taken over by the government. You might remember the big diamond rush in Marange, which is just probably about 20-30 kilometers as the crow flies from where I am on the Zimbabwean side. Lots of initially it was mined by artisanal miners, and lots of Zimbabweans went into that area and made good money mining the diamonds, until the military came in and, according to the Human Rights Watch, killed hundreds of miners, and others fled as then the government of Zimbabwe worked with Chinese companies and South Africans and others to try to monopolize the diamond mine. Well, many of the Magweja from Marange moved into Mozambique, as well as the buyers. I mentioned the West African buyer, the Lebanese. Lots of these people are kind of leftovers from the diamonds. Many moved into Manica, Villa de Manica, when Marange was going, because that was the main selling point for the artisanal miners. So the Zimbabweans kind of brought their mining know-how and expertise into Mozambique, which, again, according to the oral histories, at least I have, really expanded and dramatically increased the amount of mining, as well as some of the techniques of artisanal mining. So those are the areas I would say would help explain the relatively unique of this part of Mozambique compared to other areas where there's this great resistance.
Thank you, Professor Blair. Dr. Sanya, I see your hand was up, and then after you, Musawasha, you can go after Dr. Sanya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanya. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks, Blair, for such a inspiring presentation. A lot of my questions or comments have been addressed by the previous speaker. I wanted to ask about the questions surrounding legality and illegality. There are lots of gray areas, and that came across a lot in your presentation. How much of the mining is legal or illegal? How much, that is it, how much of the wild west is it? With the Zimbabwean know-how, as you called it, coming into the picture. How much of the Mozambican state, or how much capacity does it have to create a proper regulatory framework for miners? You have artisanal mining, you have the Chinese, you have the proper corporations, you have and then the question of the informal and informal sector. So there are so many issues that we need to unpack when trying to discuss and analyze the Mozambican mining scene. So how do we, these gray areas, how do we define, how much of it can we define, how I'll speak precisely about, and how much is it of those areas are still in the gray zone? So I mean, I just want to, so a lot of it came out in your presentation, but I'd like to just hear more about that. Thank you.
Great, many thanks, Tanya. Another excellent question, and I should note my colleague here at Carleton and friend Doris Buss, who I work with on this. She's a legal studies scholar, so a lot of the focus of kind of her part of the project is exactly around these questions, and kind of a common policy directive towards artisanal mining across sub-Saharan Africa. And I believe, I'm not an expert in South Africa, but I believe you're seeing these conversations in South Africa around Zama, even though Zama is quite often quite different from the artisanal mining I'm talking about, given that they're re-mining in closed mines and industrial mines, from my understanding. But a lot of this policy discussion is premised on what's called formalization or legalization. And the World Bank and donors like the GIZ, the Germans, and occasionally USAID, and there's different international NGOs that focus on trying to formalize artisanal mining, and you're right, I only kind of touched upon it. I didn't go into it at all. So by the letter of the law, virtually all of the alluvial artisanal miners is illegal. According to the mining law in Mozambique, they have to be get a license to mine, and then follow certain environmental protocols and regulations and so forth. That law is not enforced for a variety of reasons, but largely I've been told, I don't think this is the official reason, because so many people's livelihoods, so many Mozambican livelihoods, at least in this part of the country as well as other parts, depend on artisanal mining. When I mentioned this effort to create associations in the hard rock gold areas, and that's been a process over the last 15 or so years. The Mozambican government's been trying to do, but they've been kind of slowly, but not surely, been working on that. And again, I'm not sure how effective such an effort will be in terms of improving working conditions and helping kind of the betterment of mining for women and men miners. So it's definitely in a gray area. It offers a chance for authorities, including police and environmental police, to demand payment from the miners, because they could say what you're doing is illegal. But interestingly enough, I mentioned this real concern about artisanal mining polluting the rivers, and indeed in a number of the small rivers in the areas, they're quite brown. You kind of saw pictures, it wasn't the river where of women panning in that, and that you could see rivers like that, which is largely due to the mining activity. So it's unclear if it's all from artisanal mining or also from the small scale mines, but partially due to the actions of the environmental police, it's really rare now for artisanal miners to directly wash the gold in rivers. Most of them will create dams at least 100 or so meters away from waterways, which was recommended in order for the wastewater not to go directly into the rivers, but to filter through the earth before getting into it, which reduces the siltation in the rivers. So the miners have responded to that by changing how they're processing the alluvial gold, which is quite different. In terms of the capacity, until, gosh, I should remember this, I think until about 2012 or so, they used to have a government office that would actually supported artisanal miners. They would buy the gold, and occasionally they would provide suggestions to how to improve their mining, how to look after safety so you don't have tunnels collapsing and so forth. But that was closed down around 2012. Again, I'm not 100% sure of the date at the top of my head. And one of the mining officials I got to know in Villa actually had worked in that branch and he was widely known in the area for supporting the artisanal miners in his previous job, whereas now he's kind of policing miners as well as small scale mines. So the capacity isn't necessarily that there, but which provides probably the opportunity for many women and men to continue trying to earn some income through through artisanal mining. But it's an area of intense interest both by policymakers, but by donors and others to try to formalize. So it's a contested area, what that means and how that means, and then how that actually plays out in particular mining areas. So thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Prof. Claire. Ms. Hawash, you can go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, Prof. Blair. I just wanted to say thank you so much for a interesting presentation. I'm busy doing my PhD and I'm busy looking at the impact of mercury on reproductive health of female artisanal miners in Zimbabwe. So I just have two quick questions. And the one question was on the origins of the word magweja, because somehow until today, I'm like, oh, it's being used in another country. I've always just inherently thought that it was Shona. So if you could comment on that. And then the next question I have was around the use of mercury in gold processing. So who's exposed to it? Also, who's doing the burning of the gold, the amalgamation? Yes, those are my questions.
Wonderful to meet you over Zoom, Musawasha. Your research sounds fascinating. I look forward to hearing your results as you write them up. But love to hear more about your work, because it is such important work, and definitely, if formalization is one effort of policy, the other big effort, as you know, is try to control, if not eliminate, the use of mercury. There's a kind of the Minamata Convention is leading to at least formal policies and changes, but again, how they play out on the ground is quite different. And in fact, a UN, I think it might have been UNIDO, delegation came to this part of Mozambique. I apologize the years, but I think it was around 2011, 2012 to do instructions on how to safely use mercury, and they left some equipment in some of the small hard rock gold areas, at least at this one site I know, to try for miners to use it. I know all about this because Sam Spiegel, who, as you may know, is written on artisanal mining in Zimbabwe and Indonesia, and he's done some really great work. Sam was part of that UNIDO delegation, so he knows some of the people I know in the mining areas. The mercury is predominantly, not exclusive, but predominantly only used in the hard rock gold areas. Because that gold needs to be amalgamated. In many of the alluvial gold mining sites, the gold, they're able to see the traces on the carpet screens, so they don't need to amalgamate it. I knew of one alluvial gold mining areas which I went to where miners also use mercury to amalgamate it, but it's not common. And in this one site where UNIDO had the delegation, a number of years before I showed up, the people who amalgamated would be the man, because it was an area, and this is kind of harking back to maybe the earlier two questions from Sane and Asanda. When gold was found in this area, initially women were helping to dig, and then they were chased away once gold really was found on kind of traditional ground, saying the spirits didn't want them around. So now there's shafts in the area, and at one point they had a relationship with a South African investor, though from how people portrayed that relationship to me now is that the South African made all the money and the Mozambique didn't get anything. But in the shaft, so now artisanal miners working there, and this is controlled by an association. So kind of association members would hire miners to work the shafts, and then it would be the man miners who would be using the mercury for the amalgamation. I mentioned the equipment left by UNIDO, retorts. They left some kind of retorts for them, which is a way to amalgamate golds, you know, relatively safely, so the fumes don't get into you and you don't have to touch it. Those retorts always hung on the wall of a little shack by the dams where people process the gold. No one used the retort. They all used the mercury in their hands. And you know, and then threw away the mercury in the environment. So, which leads, of course, to the risk of further mercury poisoning. But in that area, it was a man using it. The women would be working in the dams. They would be reprocessing the soil. So I guess a few women would use mercury. They would reprocess the soil on the bottom of the dams. So a few of them used mercury. And then of course, by staying in the water where the mercury is being used, you have the risk of contamination that way as well, which you would know much better than myself. So thank you for the good question.
Thank you, Professor Blair. I think that's all our time for today. I just want to say thank you to our speaker for the fascinating talk. Please do visit the HUMA website to get more info about our upcoming event. Divine, I'm going to end the talk here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for the great contribution. It was very interesting.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity for talking and getting fantastic feedback and issues for me to think about as we write more. So thank you. I look for further conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.